The OSMO Pocket 3 is a pretty cool device. I picked it up to help me with some gimbal B-roll creation as well as some front-facing narrative work that I do here on these YouTube videos. While I was exploring the features of this gimbal camera, I started playing around with the slow motion features on it. And I was pretty amazed at how well it did. I found that it has a unique setting that I've not seen on other action cameras, and that's a setting where you can really elevate your slow motion clips. I'll show you how it works coming up. Now to start working with slow motion on the OSMO Pocket 3, simply tap the icon on the bottom left of the screen. That'll bring you into some different shooting options. You can switch between video to stills to time-lapse, etc. Scroll to the left until you get to the word slow. It's spelled S-L-O. This is the slow motion version for this camera. Once there, swipe up from the center bottom of the screen. It'll give you some resolution options. Now for this demo, I'm going to be using 4K at 120 frames per second. You do have the option to swipe to the left to get up to 240 frames per second, but that shoots in 1080p. Now I'd rather shoot in 4K, and I'll show you why in just a bit. I like to shoot in manual mode, so the exposure doesn't change while I'm shooting. To do that, I swipe from the right and hit the little box that says Pro. The little box turns yellow, and a whole bunch more options are available to us. I tap on exposure and move it to M for manual, and I set the shutter speed at 1/240th of a second. Then I set the ISO based on how much light I have on the scene. Sometimes you might need a neutral density filter if you're shooting out in really bright sunlight. Let's record something in slow motion. Simply hit the record and create your slow motion clip. When we bring that clip into our video editing software, I'm using Final Cut Pro here, but you can do the same thing in just about any of the other video editing softwares like Resolve or Premiere. You can do the same thing. You can set the speed of the clip to slow it down to get the look that you want. One of the things to consider in video making is motion blur. That's why when we're shooting a standard clip at 30 frames per second, we don't usually go above the speed of 1/160th of a second for our shutter speed. That's because you want to have some motion blur between frames. That way the human brain can make up the difference between frames and create a visual motion effect, and you can actually see the motion. Now, if you're a still photographer, think of it like this. If you want to stop motion, you're going to shoot using a faster shutter speed. If you want to show motion, you're going to shoot at a slower shutter speed to see the blur of that motion. Now the same can be said for video. You need some blur in the images to get that feeling of motion. With video, if we shot a standard clip at higher shutter speed, we might notice a frenetic action to the clip. While this technique can be used to tell a story, and of course it was famously used in the battle scenes of Saving Private Ryan, but most cases you want some motion blur in your clips, so don't set the shutter speed too high. Unless you're going for that jittery action scene, use the rule where the shutter speed can be no more than double the frame rate. If you're shooting at 30 frames per second, shoot no faster than 1/160th of a second as your shutter speed. Now this brings us back to our slow motion clip. We shot the clip of bouncing balls at 1/240th of a second as our shutter speed. In the editing software, I slowed it down quite a ways to 25% of its original speed. If you look closely at the balls, you can see that we maintained some sort of that motion blur. But what if we wanted to do better? The shutter speed rule doesn't necessarily apply to a slow motion clip, and especially not on a super slow motion clip. As we slow the clips down in post, we are essentially increasing the frames per second that we're viewing. So let's go back to the Pocket 3 and make some changes. Go to the Pro mode again, swipe from right side of the screen and choose the Pro options. Go into the exposure and move the shutter speed all the way to 1/4000th of a second. This is going to freeze the action of every single frame. Now herein lies the beauty of working with the OSMO Pocket 3. It allows us to set the shutter speed independently, giving us more freedom in our exposures. Now the lens is set at f2. We can't do anything about that, so we don't have any control over altering the aperture, but the shutter speed and the ISO can be controlled. Let's do another clip and see how we can slow that down. I'm back in Final Cut again, and here the balls are slowed down to 25% just like the last clip. However, with the new sharpness of the frames by the way of raising that shutter speed to 1/4000th of a second, we're able to see crisper slow motion. We even have the option of slowing it down even further, say 10%. This is what that looks like. Now, if you're getting some value out of this content on the Osmo Pocket 3, let me know in the comments below. Also, while you're there, hit the like button and then subscribe button so you don't miss any of my videos, and hit that little bell to be reminded of the videos as well. I appreciate it. Once I discovered some of the slow motion capabilities of the Osmo Pocket 3, I thought it would be pretty useful in some of my nature work. So I set up the Pocket 3 on a tripod and position it next to my bird feeder. This time of year, we mostly have lesser goldfinch and house finches feeding. So I thought I'd try to get some slow motion of these local birds in action. Here's what that looks like. So I'm out here by my bird feeder, and what I want to do is set up this camera so I can get some shots of the birds coming in, and we're going to do it in slow motion. So as I set this up, you'll see that the camera is set up nice and close to capture the birds coming in here in slow motion. So let's go ahead and turn that on. We've done our settings for slow motion, so we're all good to go on that. One of the things that I want to do though is I have a limitation with this camera. It's at f2 is the aperture. F2 is the aperture, and there's nothing I can do to change that. So in order to get more depth of field, as an example, with the camera set up in this position, I'm going to probably get depth of field of probably about this much, so not a lot. So then all the birds have to come in here and land here in order to be in focus. So in order to combat that, I want to get more depth of field. So the way I do that is I pull this whole camera back apparatus back. Now you're probably saying, okay, Taylor, that's not going to work great because you're going to end up with a wider shot and it's going to be not as close. But I'm shooting in 4K. So when I shoot in 4K, in post, I can crop in back to that same shot that I had before, only the difference is now my depth of field is going to be this long. I'm going to have much more depth of field, but it'll all look the same once we're done shooting the clip. So this is going to be set up here, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it on and just let the birds come in, and then when I'll come back and check it. So let's go ahead and do that, and we'll see what happens. And add to that, I can't use the subject tracking when you have your camera set on slow motion settings. You also lose the ability to set your focus to product showcase. Now, if you don't know, product showcase features a way to just focus on the thing that's closest to the lens, and it always makes sure that is in focus. But that's not available in the slow motion features. When you're shooting close up, you're only going to get just so much in focus. With slow motion, you're usually shooting things that are moving fast, obviously. In order to get more in focus, I simply move the camera back a bit, thereby increasing that window of an area that's in focus. In post, because it's shot in 4K, I can then crop the whole clip back a little closer to the scene, but I'll be keeping that wider depth of field since it was originally shot with the camera farther away from the subject. That's my little trick for getting more close-up area in focus while using the fixed lens that's like this on the OSMO Pocket 3 camera. Until next time, this is Terry VanderHeiden. I'll leave you with one last slow motion clip. Enjoy.